The night of June 18, 1944, hung heavy over the Philippine Sea, its darkness broken only by the faint shimmer of moonlight rippling across the waves. On the decks of Japan's forward reconnaissance cruisers, lookouts scanned the horizon with tired eyes, unaware that the next few minutes would shatter the confidence of a navy once feared across the Pacific. Their radar, primitive, inconsistent, and often plagued by static, showed nothing unusual. But far beyond their range, over 900 aircraft from the U.S. Fifth Fleet were already climbing into formation, rising from aircraft carriers spread across the sea like floating fortresses. As dawn approached, a faint glow appeared in the east, at first mistaken for weather, then for a distant fire. Only when the horizon exploded into a blazing line of light did the truth strike. The American fleet, larger than anything Japan had faced since Midway, was advancing with the quiet inevitability of a coming storm. Lieutenant Masaru Hattori, watching through binoculars, later wrote, "It was as if the ocean itself had given birth to a wall of steel." In that moment, standing under a sky turning red, he, and many others, felt the first tremor of a realization Japan had long feared. The tide of the war was no longer turning. It had already turned. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase of accelerating imbalance, a widening gulf between American industrial strength and Japan's diminishing ability to sustain prolonged combat across vast oceans. The defeat at Midway 2 years earlier had cost Japan 4 frontline carriers and an irreplaceable cadre of elite pilots, setting into motion a downward spiral that no amount of bravery or tactical innovation could reverse. The Imperial Japanese Navy still commanded pockets of formidable strength. Battle-hardened aviators, well-drilled carrier crews, and ships engineered with a precision born from decades of naval heritage, but the strategic reality had grown stark. American shipyards were launching new carriers faster than Japan could repair damaged ones, and the US training system was producing pilots in unprecedented numbers, each passing through programs designed around survival, coordination, and technical mastery. Meanwhile, Japan's pilot training pipeline had been stripped to the bone. Where once aviators spent hundreds of hours mastering carrier landings, night operations, and formation tactics, by 1944, many reached the front with barely a fraction of that experience. Senior Japanese commanders knew this shortfall well. Internal memoranda from the combined fleet referenced an erosion of skill that threatens the very core of air operations. Compounding these human losses was the crushing weight of logistical strain. Japan's oil situation had deteriorated catastrophically after the US captured the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, severing key supply routes. Tanker losses mounted, fuel storage dwindled, and entire squadrons remained grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Carriers designed for fast, aggressive operations were forced to limit training flights to conserve fuel, leaving pilots underprepared for the battles to come. American intelligence officers monitoring radio intercepts and shipping patterns recognized the vulnerability and planned operations specifically to deepen Japan's logistical chokehold. By early June 1944, as U.S. submarines prowled the Philippine Sea, they sank tanker after tanker, tightening the noose around the Japanese fleet and pushing its commanders into a dangerous position. They needed to fight before they were ready, because not fighting meant surrendering the Pacific entirely. The geography of the Philippine Sea turned these strategic imbalances into tactical realities. Stretching across a broad swath of open ocean, the area offered few island outposts for reconnaissance or emergency landings. Success depended heavily on long-range detection and coordinated command, two areas where the United States enjoyed decisive superiority. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, operated with a suite of advanced radar systems that could detect aircraft and ships at remarkable distances, enabling commanders to shape air operations with confidence. Japan, by contrast, relied heavily on human lookouts and limited-range air search radar whose returns were often distorted by atmospheric noise. On the morning of the coming battle, these limitations would blind Japan at the very moment they needed clarity most. American planners, preparing for what they expected to be a decisive confrontation, assembled Task Force 58 into strike groups arranged around fleet carriers and light carriers, each bristling with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft. The coordination between these groups was not simply functional, it was industrial in scale. Thousands of men worked in synchronized routines, armorers loading bombs into aircraft bays, mechanics checking engines with flashlights beneath the glow of deck lamps, intelligence teams distributing maps and expected enemy flight paths. When the Americans launched their aircraft on June 19th, the scene was described by one deck officer as a machine with a heartbeat. Every carrier releasing fighters into the sky in a rhythm so tight it resembled choreography. Japanese observers later admitted they had never witnessed such disciplined mass sortie generation. It demonstrated not only technological superiority, but a depth of logistical planning impossible for Japan to match under wartime strain. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders prepared their own forces in a climate of tension tempered by denial. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, leading the mobile fleet, believed that Japan still possessed the ability to deliver a decisive blow if they could lure the American carriers into range of their land-based aircraft stationed on Guam and other islands. This belief, however, rested on flawed assumptions. Many of the land-based units were already worn down by prior engagements, their pilots tired, aircraft poorly maintained, and fuel reserves dangerously low. Yet the Japanese high command insisted on an offensive strategy, fearing that remaining passive would allow American forces to advance westward unchallenged. Pilots gathered on carrier decks, some veterans of earlier campaigns who understood the dangers, others, young men with little more than classroom training. Many clutched good luck charms, whispering quiet prayers before climbing into cockpits. One pilot later recalled, "We felt the weight of history on our shoulders, but also the emptiness of knowing we could not meet it as our predecessors had." All these pressures, industrial decline, oil scarcity, training deficiencies, technological disparity, strategic miscalculations, were converging with a force that threatened to break the core of Japan's naval power. As both fleets maneuvered into the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, the stage was set for a clash that would expose every weakness and amplify every strength, pushing the conflict toward a decisive moment that would be explored in far greater depth as the background expanded into broader political, logistical, and internal dynamics in the next part. Internally, Japan entered the summer of 1944 burdened by fractures that ran deeper than any external threat the United States could impose. Political leaders in Tokyo clung to the rhetoric of inevitable victory, while naval strategists, reading fuel charts, loss reports, and reconnaissance summaries, recognized an irreversible trajectory. Within the combined fleet, staff officers debated how to preserve operational coherence in a war shaped increasingly by factors beyond their control. Communications between Tokyo and forward fleet elements were often delayed or incomplete, and a culture of reluctance to deliver bad news led to distorted assessments of fleet readiness. Some officers exaggerated fuel reserves to avoid censure, others downplayed pilot fatigue, mechanical failures, or maintenance shortcomings, fearing that acknowledging weakness would be interpreted as disloyalty. These patterns formed layers of self-deception that masked operational vulnerabilities at a moment when clarity mattered most. One internal fleet memorandum discovered after the war stated with understated urgency, "A great battle is approaching and we are entering it with illusions." Complicating these internal distortions was the growing disconnect between Japan's strategic objectives and its practical capabilities. The Imperial Navy's pre-war doctrine emphasized decisive battle, one immense clash that would shatter the enemy's fleet and restore balance. But by 1944, decisive battle was no longer an achievable option. The US Navy's carrier strength alone far exceeded Japan's, and the logistical gap widened by the month. American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor provided continuous intelligence on Japanese fleet movements, reducing the chances of achieving surprise. US submarines severed Japan's access to oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, forcing the fleet to operate on dwindling supplies. Even if Japan managed to inflict significant losses on the American carriers, they had no means to replace their own. Meanwhile, American shipyards launched Essex-class carriers at a pace unmatched in naval history, each vessel bringing with it seasoned pilots, battle-tested officers, and air groups trained to fight in coordinated layered formations. The Japanese fleet, by contrast, was increasingly held together by improvisation. Damaged aircraft were cannibalized for parts, inexperienced pilots were rushed into combat, and naval infantry were reassigned as mechanics. These symptoms of strain were not isolated, they were structural. The internal morale of the Japanese fleet reflected these pressures. Veteran pilots, survivors of Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and earlier clashes, carried the weight of memory, aware that the brilliant generation of aviators who had defined Japan's early war victories was gone. Their replacements, though eager, lacked the deep training halls that had once produced the Navy's elite. Conversations in the ready rooms took on a tone of stoic resignation. Flight leaders gave final briefings with the knowledge that many of the young men listening would not return. One pilot later wrote, "We felt like shadows of those who came before us, carrying the same responsibilities without the same strength." Below deck, mechanics worked through the night, coaxing life out of engines that had flown too many sorties and endured too little maintenance. Each takeoff in the coming battle would be a gamble. Japan's land-based air power, central to Admiral Ozawa's plan, had likewise deteriorated. Airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian were under relentless pressure from American raids. Aircraft sat in revetments with half-repaired wings or leaking fuel lines. Pilots slept in shifts on sandbags, awakened by the drone of B-24 Liberators or the whistle of incoming bombs. The psychological toll was profound. Veteran pilots admitted to chronic exhaustion. Newer aviators described being thrown forward like arrows without fletching. Yet command directives continued to paint these units as decisive reinforcements capable of turning the tide of any engagement. When the time came for them to launch, their numbers and readiness would prove catastrophically insufficient. On the American side, long-range planning matured into a finely tuned machine. Task Force 58 operated with an efficiency that symbolized the broader industrial capacity behind it. Each carrier coordinated with dozens of support vessels, destroyers, supply ships, oilers, hospital ships, and communications vessels that transformed the fleet into a mobile city of war. Logistics officers tracked fuel consumption to decimal points. Meteorological teams studied wind patterns to calculate launch windows. Gunnery officers planned layered anti-aircraft defenses capable of creating overlapping kill zones. This systemic precision gave the Americans an advantage that extended beyond firepower. It gave them the ability to dictate the tempo of the conflict. Carrier groups could reposition hundreds of miles overnight, launch massive strikes at dawn, and recover aircraft with practiced fluidity. These contrasts between illusion and analysis, scarcity and abundance, exhaustion and readiness were not abstract. They shaped the very structure of the battle that both nations were now approaching. For Japan, the coming clash represented a final attempt to halt an enemy whose reach seemed to grow with each passing month. For the United States, it was an opportunity to break the spine of Japan's naval air power and accelerate the collapse of its outer defenses. As both fleets closed the distance in the days leading to June 19th, tension rose across the Philippine Sea, and the perspectives of sailors, pilots, commanders, and civilians would soon collide with the harsh reality of the battle, setting the stage for the intimate human viewpoints explored in the perspectives section. From the decks of Japan's carriers and cruisers, the coming clash did not feel like a grand strategic confrontation. It felt like a tightening storm, a rising pressure in the air that every sailor, lookout, and pilot sensed long before the first American aircraft appeared. For the young Japanese aviators assigned to the mobile fleet, the Philippine Sea had become a crucible of fear and expectation. Many of these pilots were barely trained, their flight hours a fraction of what their predecessors had earned, yet they carried the burden of defending an empire in retreat. One of them, Ensign Hiroshi Takeda, later wrote that he spent the night before the battle staring at the faint glow of the horizon, unable to sleep, listening to the creaking of the carrier's hull. "We were told we would strike the blow that saved our nation," he wrote, "but none of us felt like saviors." When orders finally came to prepare aircraft for launch, the tension among the flight crews was palpable. Men fumbling with gear, mechanics muttering prayers beneath their breath, and officers forcing calm they did not feel. The emotional weight was not fear alone. It was the awareness that they were stepping into a battle their country could no longer afford to lose. For Japanese commanders, the perspective was one of strategic anxiety sharpened by incomplete information. Admiral Ozawa's staff struggled to reconcile conflicting reconnaissance reports with their own expectations. Radar screens flickered with static, radio intelligence was sporadic, and human lookouts could see only what the vast ocean permitted. Some officers insisted that the Americans were further away than feared, while others argued that the US fleet might already be within striking range. The strategic plan depended on timing, launching a coordinated attack that fused carrier and land-based aircraft, but timing required clarity that simply did not exist. Staff diaries recovered after the war reveal notes such as "We fight under a blindfold and hope has replaced reconnaissance." Yet even under such constraints, commanders pressed forward, driven by the doctrine that decisive action, however risky, was preferable to stagnation. Every minute spent searching for the enemy was a minute of fuel lost forever. The technological perspective added another layer to the tension, revealing the widening gap between Japanese and American capabilities. On the US carriers, fighter directors monitored radar scopes that painted the sky in clean, sweeping arcs, each pass revealing altitude, direction, and distance of approaching aircraft. This allowed American commanders to choreograph their defenses with near-surgical precision. On the Japanese side, radar operators struggled with sets that barely functioned in harsh conditions, their screens cluttered with atmospheric noise. A technician aboard the carrier Taiho later described the frustration. "We saw ghosts on our screens. Sometimes they were clouds, sometimes reflections, sometimes nothing at all. When the Americans came, we did not see them, we felt them." Meanwhile, US pilots soared into the sky with aircraft that had undergone rigorous testing and maintenance protocols, while Japanese pilots often flew machines held together by improvised repairs. The contrast was stark, not only in technology but in reliability. The Americans could plan around their equipment, the Japanese had to plan around its failures. Finally, the human perspective of the Japanese sailors underscored the emotional fragility of a fleet approaching its breaking point. Below deck, engine crews toiled in sweltering heat, shoveling through maintenance tasks on aging machinery that strained against every demand placed on it. Many sailors admitted later that they sensed something irrevocable about the atmosphere aboard the fleet. Conversations became shorter, laughter rarer, and the ritual of bowing to senior officers carried a weight of unspoken dread. On mess decks, meals were eaten in silence, interrupted only by the thrum of the engines and the occasional distant rumble of Allied air patrols probing the edges of the fleet's reach. One petty officer later recalled, "We felt as if we were carrying a great stone on our backs, and every hour it grew heavier." The cumulative effect of fear, fatigue, and fatalism created a psychological environment in which even minor setbacks felt monumental. These human fractures mattered, not simply as emotional details but as forces that shaped reaction times, decision-making, and the ability of crews to adapt under pressure. Together, these four perspectives, aviators, commanders, technicians, and sailors, formed the emotional and operational landscape as Japan's fleet moved unknowingly toward one of the greatest air-naval catastrophes in its history, setting the stage for an even broader collapse of leadership, tactics, and morale explored in the next phase. Within the upper echelons of Japan's naval leadership, the tension that had simmered for months finally erupted into a quiet, suffocating awareness that they were steering a fleet into a battle for which it was fundamentally unprepared. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a man known for his calm composure and loyalty, found himself carrying the unbearable weight of decisions shaped less by strategic preference and more by national desperation. His staff officers, many of them veterans of earlier campaigns, grappled with the knowledge that the mobile fleet they commanded was a shadow of the force that had once dominated the Pacific. Conversations in the command room were marked by careful tones, men choosing words that balanced honesty with the need to avoid triggering panics. Some argued that Japan must strike first to seize the initiative, others urged caution, noting that the fleet lacked both reconnaissance clarity and the pilot strength necessary for sustained combat. Yet everyone understood the truth beneath their discussions. Retreat was impossible, hesitation unthinkable, and the eyes of Tokyo were fixed upon them with unrealistic expectations. Humans, politics, and fear had become inseparable forces shaping every order transmitted across the fleet. From a tactical standpoint, the strain was even more visible. Japanese fighter groups, once symbols of tactical innovation and elite precision, now consisted largely of inexperienced pilots whose training had been truncated by fuel shortages and operational urgency. Their squadron leaders carried an impossible burden, expected to lead flawless attacks with pilots who lacked the hours needed to fly in tight formation, execute coordinated dives, or navigate complex return routes across open ocean. During pre-sortie briefings, flight commanders emphasized discipline and unity, but they could not ignore the fact that many of their men struggled with basic carrier landings. The looming reality was that America's air groups would be faster, more coordinated, and more numerous, and that the US radar network would detect and intercept Japanese aircraft long before they approached striking distance. The tactical imbalance was profound, and it gnawed at the confidence of even the most seasoned aviators. One commander later wrote, "We were expected to fight as lions, but we had been given the wings of sparrows." The broader social impact within the Japanese fleet added yet another layer of psychological pressure. Sailors spoke in hushed tones about the rumors circulating from the home islands, food shortages, relentless American raids on industrial centers, and the growing sense among civilians that the war was slipping away from them. These stories traveled across the fleet like whispered ghosts, shaping the emotional climate aboard ships already worn down by fatigue. Some sailors carried family letters stained with salt water and sweat, describing air raid sirens in Yokohama or Osaka, the uncertainty of ration lines, or the loss of homes to incendiary bombardments. Others clung to small tokens, paper charms, lockets, or children's drawings, reminders of a distant world that seemed increasingly fragile. The psychological distance between the battlefield and the homeland had collapsed. Every sailor knew that the outcome of the coming battle would carry consequences that extended far beyond the Philippine Sea. On the technical front, the Japanese fleet was fighting not only the Americans but its own mechanical decay. Radar systems that should have provided early warning flickered with interference, their operators tapping consoles in frustration as the screens filled with static. Radio towers creaked under the strain of constant transmissions, and engines on several carriers produced irregular vibrations that engineers knew indicated deeper issues. Maintenance crews worked frantically, crawling through narrow passageways with wrenches and grease-stained manuals, aware that they could only delay the inevitable. Meanwhile, on the American side, efficiency reached a level bordering on orchestration. Fighter direction centers aboard U.S. carriers tracked airspace with precision, coordinating interception patterns and vectoring squadrons with near-perfect accuracy. The contrast could not have been sharper. One fleet operating within the framework of modern integrated warfare, the other relying on overburdened systems strained past their limits. Yet behind all these layers, leadership tension, tactical fragility, emotional fatigue, and technological disparity, lived a final unspoken perspective, the quiet intuition shared by many Japanese sailors and aviators that the battle ahead would mark not just a confrontation, but a reckoning. It was the sense that the Pacific, so vast and unforgiving, was tightening around them like a vice. Every lookout scanning the horizon, every officer studying maps, every mechanic wiping oil from his hands felt the same invisible truth. Their fleet was sailing into a storm that could break the last thread of Japan's naval air power. And as dawn approached on June 19th, that storm began to gather with unmistakable force, guiding the narrative toward the decisive events that would define the coming climax and forever shape the fate of the Pacific War. The morning of June 19th, 1944 dawned with a deceptive calm over the Philippine Sea, the sky painted in soft streaks of gold that belied the violence gathering just beyond the horizon. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, American pilots moved with deliberate efficiency, their flight suits rustling softly as they stepped across metal decks still slick with night dew. Below them, engines throbbed with rising intensity as deck crews prepared the first waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo aircraft. Radar operators aboard the flagship USS Lexington observed the first signs of Japan's approaching strike groups, thin arcs on their screens, distant but unmistakably inbound. The Americans had known this attack was coming. Their radar had detected the assembly of Japanese aircraft hours before any visual contact. In contrast, the Japanese fleet operated under a veil of uncertainty, launching their aircraft with only fragmented reconnaissance reports and fading hope of achieving surprise. As the first Japanese formations rose from their carriers, the pilots felt a mix of anticipation and dread, their aircraft laden with bombs and torpedoes that represented the last vestiges of Japan's strategic offensive power. Many of them had less than 200 flight hours. Some had never flown beyond sight of land, yet they were now expected to deliver a blow that would decide the future of the empire. The Japanese strike groups advanced in waves, fighters in loose escort formations followed by torpedo bombers and dive bombers flying in scattered lines that reflected their inexperience and the chaotic nature of their launch sequence. As they crossed into the operational envelope of the American fleet, the U.S. radar screens lit up with unmistakable clarity. Fighter direction officers issued rapid instructions, vectoring dozens of F-6F Hellcats into interception paths with a precision born from training technology and a deep understanding of layered air defense. In minutes, the American fighters were climbing into the morning sun, positioning themselves high above the incoming Japanese formations. Captain Bill Dean, leading one of the interception groups, later recalled how the rising light silhouetted the Japanese aircraft below. They looked like a cloud of insects drifting toward us, unaware of the net they were flying into. His description captured the asymmetry that defined the battle, not merely in technology, but in awareness. The Americans knew exactly where their enemy was. The Japanese did not even know they had been found. The first clash unfolded with devastating speed. Hellcats dove from altitude, their wings cutting through the sky with a predatory precision. Their 50 caliber guns erupted in controlled bursts, tearing into formations of Japanese fighters that struggled to respond. Many Japanese pilots attempted to maneuver, but their aircraft, older models with worn engines, could not match the power or climb rate of the American fighters. Some Japanese aviators lacking combat experience broke formation prematurely, diving toward the sea in desperate attempts to escape. Others pressed forward, clinging to their mission despite the chaos erupting around them. The air filled with smoke trails, shattered metal, and the echo of engines choking under fire. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese aircraft fell burning into the sea. Yet the survivors continued on, driven by duty more than hope, pushing toward the distant silhouettes where they believed the American carriers waited. The American defensive screen tightened relentlessly. Additional fighter groups, guided by precise radar vectors, intercepted the remnants of each Japanese wave before they could approach dive-bombing altitude. Hellcats slashed through the formations again and again, exploiting superior speed, firepower, and communication. Meanwhile, U.S. anti-aircraft batteries aboard cruisers and carriers remained on standby, their crews watching the sky with disciplined readiness, waiting for the rare moments when a Japanese aircraft managed to slip past the fighter screen. But such moments were few. By the time the first Japanese strike group neared visual range of the American fleet, it had already been reduced to scattered fragments, exhausted pilots flying damaged aircraft, many trailing smoke or oil. And when these remnants finally emerged into sight of Task Force 58, they were met by concentric bursts of anti-aircraft fire that filled the air with a lethal haze of shrapnel. A handful of Japanese bombers attempted dives, but each was torn apart before releasing its payload. The Americans, executing layered defenses exactly as designed, maintained cohesion throughout the assault. For the Japanese aviators who survived the initial onslaught, the experience belonged to a realm beyond calculation. Their radios filled with frantic calls for help, sudden silence from downed wingmen, and incomplete vector instructions from carriers that could no longer guide them. One pilot, Lieutenant Satoru Kojima, described the surreal moment when he realized that the sky itself seemed aligned against him. Everywhere I turned, there were American fighters. It felt as if the heavens had chosen sides. His account echoed the broader truth of the battle. The U.S. Navy had achieved a level of airborne dominance that rendered the Japanese strategy obsolete before it could unfold. And as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft fell to the sea, the sheer scale of the losses revealed a catastrophe still deepening, setting the stage for the continuation of this turning point in the next phase. As the morning advanced into midday, the scale of Japan's unraveling air assault became unmistakably catastrophic. The remnants of Ozawa's strike groups, those few aircraft that had managed to evade the layered American fighter screen, now struggled toward the estimated position of the U.S. carriers, guided by compass headings and fading fuel reserves rather than any expectation of success. Many pilots, disoriented by the chaos of battle, overshot the American formation entirely, flying past it without seeing a single ship. Others attempted hopeless search patterns over a featureless ocean, aware with every passing minute that their fuel gauges were sinking into the red. A handful did sight the American fleet, diving with last reserves of strength and resolve, but their efforts met the same fate as earlier attacks. U.S. anti-aircraft guns erupted into blistering walls of fire, 5-inch shells detonating in precise patterns, proximity fuses sensing the approach of metal and flame. The sky above Task Force 58 shimmered with bursts of orange and black as shells carved lethal spheres that no aircraft could penetrate intact. A few Japanese planes broke through long enough to begin attack runs, but nearly all were torn apart before releasing their bombs. One D-4Y, Judy dive bomber, managed to plunge toward the USS Bunker Hill, only to disintegrate in mid-dive under converging fire from several ships. Its fragments splashed harmlessly into the sea, a moment emblematic of the wider battle. Japan's last offensive hopes arrived over the horizon already mortally wounded. Meanwhile, the American counteroffensive unfolded with a decisiveness that only widened the gulf between the two fleets. Once the final Japanese attack wave was broken, pilots aboard the U.S. carriers prepared to strike back at the mobile fleet itself. Search planes from the USS Enterprise and other carriers fanned out across the ocean, hunting for the retreating Japanese formation. Their radar and reconnaissance reports soon painted a clear picture. Ozawa's fleet had scattered in multiple directions, attempting evasive maneuvers in hopes of avoiding the inevitable American counterstroke. When the positions were confirmed, Task Force 58 launched massive afternoon strike groups, squadrons of Helldivers, Avengers, and Hellcats, climbing into formation with engines roaring in thick unison. For many American pilots, this moment carried a grim weight. They understood that the Japanese fleet they were about to attack was no longer the formidable force it had been at Coral Sea or Santa Cruz. It was depleted, underfueled, and vulnerable, yet the mission remained critical. Neutralizing Japan's remaining carriers would prevent any future chance of recovery. The American strike groups descended upon the Japanese fleet with relentless precision. The new carrier Taiho, pride of Japan's naval aviation and Ozawa's flagship, had already suffered internal explosions earlier in the day after a single American torpedo struck near her aviation fuel storage. Fumes had spread through ventilation shafts, and the hangar deck, packed with fueled aircraft, became a tinderbox. When the American strike aircraft arrived overhead, they found Taiho listing slightly and trailing smoke. Torpedo planes pressed their runs, navigating through sporadic anti-aircraft fire from escort ships. Moments later, additional explosions rippled through Taiho's interior, the accumulated fumes igniting in a catastrophic chain reaction that tore open her hull. The carrier that symbolized Japan's attempt to reclaim naval dominance sank slowly into the sea, taking with it hundreds of crew and much of Ozawa's command infrastructure. Elsewhere, the carrier Shokaku and Hio faced similar fates. Shokaku, one of the last surviving veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack, was struck by multiple torpedoes dropped by Avengers that approached at low altitude. The impacts ruptured aviation fuel stores, triggering intense fires that raged uncontrollably through her decks. Smoke poured from her flight deck in towering plumes as sailors attempted desperate firefighting measures. But every minute brought another explosion, another surge of flame, until the order came to abandon ship. Shokaku slid beneath the waves shortly afterward, ending the service of one of Japan's most storied carriers. The sinking of Hio followed a similar pattern: torpedo hits, explosions from internal fuel vapor, and a rapid loss of stability that sent her bow dipping under the waves as surviving crew leapt into oil-slicked water. For Japanese sailors, the destruction of these carriers was more than material loss. It was a collapse of identity. The mobile fleet had once been the embodiment of Japan's naval spirit, a force that projected power across the Pacific. Now, men on surviving ships watched in stunned silence as the sea swallowed their capital vessels one by one. Survivors clung to debris, calling out for comrades lost in the smoke and flames. Some later described a moment when the surrounding sea felt painfully quiet, broken only by the crackle of burning wreckage drifting on the waves. That silence, they said, carried the weight of a truth no commander dared speak. Japan would never again mount a carrier airstrike of comparable scale. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in the same fiery hues that had marked the Americans' morning advance, the remnants of Ozawa's fleet limped away into the fading light, their decks battered, their air wings annihilated, their communications fractured. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for its lopsided air losses, had ended in overwhelming American victory. Japan had lost the core of its remaining naval aviation strength, hundreds of pilots, and multiple carriers in a single day. Yet, the full consequences of this disaster were only beginning to unfold, for the destruction wrought in these hours would ripple across strategy, morale, industry, and the very trajectory of Japan's war effort, setting the stage for the sober assessments and irreversible truths explored in the aftermath. In the hours following the destruction of the Japanese carrier force, the Philippine Sea settled into an eerie stillness broken only by the rhythmic slapping of waves against drifting wreckage. The smoke that had earlier risen in towering pillars began to flatten into a low haze, spreading across the water like a shroud that concealed the scattered remains of Japan's naval air power. American search planes circled overhead, marking positions of survivors while transmitting coded summaries back to their carriers, summaries that revealed in cold detail a collapse so complete that even veteran intelligence officers struggled to absorb its implications. Japan's losses were staggering, more than 300 aircraft destroyed in a single day, many of them without ever reaching effective attack range, and 3 carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio, lost to torpedoes and internal explosions. These numbers, though devastating on their own, represented deeper systemic damage. Japan had not merely lost machines, it had lost the last generation of pilots capable of fighting a modern carrier war. The aviators who had once flown with confidence over Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal were gone, replaced by young men whose training could not compensate for the nation's shrinking industrial and logistical capacity. Their deaths signified the end of Japan's ability to project air power at sea. Across the surviving ships of Ozawa's fleet, the human toll became painfully visible. Sailors hauled exhausted survivors out of the water, many coated in fuel oil, their faces streaked with soot and salt. Some wept openly as they recounted the sudden explosions that had torn through their carriers. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to speak at all. The atmosphere on destroyers and cruisers shifted from frantic activity to a kind of hollow fatigue as crew members attempted to treat burns, bandage shrapnel wounds, and identify those who had been lost. Officers moved among the men with subdued voices, aware that morale had reached a depth from which recovery seemed nearly impossible. The Japanese Navy had endured losses before, Midway, Santa Cruz, the Bismarck Sea, but those battles had still been fought with the belief that experience, determination, or tactical brilliance could shift the balance. Now, for the first time, many sailors admitted privately that no amount of courage could reverse the technological and industrial gulf that had opened between Japan and the United States. The strategic consequences spread even faster than the emotional ones. With 3 fleet carriers gone and hundreds of aircraft destroyed, Japan no longer possessed the airborne strength required to defend the Marianas, a region whose airfields the United States intended to use as forward bases for the B-29 superfortress. The loss of these islands would bring the home islands themselves into range of sustained strategic bombing, a reality that Japanese military planners had feared since the earliest days of the war. Reports transmitted back to Tokyo described the situation with stark finality. One line from Ozawa's staff captured the essence: "Our offensive capacity is finished." Naval headquarters attempted to soften the language in official communiques, but within the inner circles of the Imperial Navy there was no misunderstanding. The fleet could no longer protect the Empire's outer defenses, and without those defenses, the war's trajectory would soon turn inward toward Japan itself. Beyond military strategy, the broader implications reached into Japan's industrial structure. Training new pilots required fuel, airfields, and functioning aircraft, resources now critically depleted. Carriers could not be replaced. Shipyards lacked steel, labor, and time. Even if the Navy attempted to rebuild its air arm, the effort would take years the Empire did not have. American intelligence, analyzing intercepted communications in the days following the battle, noted the unusual absence of coordinated planning from Japanese Naval Command, a sign that the fleet's operational coherence had fractured. The psychological blow was equally severe. Senior officers who had once spoken confidently about decisive battle now spoke in hushed tones about choosing where the fleet might die with honor Yet the full measure of the aftermath extended beyond immediate losses. It reshaped the strategic logic of the Pacific War, accelerating the American advance and altering the balance of hope and despair on both sides of the conflict. The consequences of June 19 to 20 did not end with the sinking of ships. They rippled outward into decisions, reinforcements, and campaigns still to come, forming the foundation for an even more profound shift explored in the next section. In the weeks following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the far-reaching consequences of Japan's defeat settled across the Pacific with a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. The loss of 3 carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots created a void that no amount of determination or last-minute improvisation could fill. Across Japan's naval air stations, instructors reviewed empty rosters and scattered equipment, aware that entire training classes had vanished into the sea. What few pilots remained were either inexperienced or fatigued veterans whose confidence had been shaken by the sheer scale of the American onslaught. Maintenance crews reported that aircraft production could not keep pace with losses, and even when new fighters rolled off assembly lines, they lacked the engines, fuel, or spare parts needed to survive prolonged operations. Japan's dream of a decisive counterattack, the doctrine that had shaped its strategic culture since the Russo-Japanese War, had dissolved into a practical impossibility. Now, the Navy's struggle was no longer about winning the Pacific. It was about slowing the tide long enough to delay the inevitable. The collapse of Japan's carrier air arm also accelerated the American offensive in ways that reshaped the final year of the war. With air superiority effectively uncontested over the Marianas, U.S. forces pushed rapidly to secure Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, objectives that would have been far more costly if Japan had maintained a functioning carrier fleet. Once captured, these islands provided the U.S. Army Air Forces with the forward airfields needed to launch B-29 Super Fortress missions directly against the Japanese home islands. For the first time, Japan found itself within sustained range of strategic bombardment. American planners understood the significance immediately. The destruction of Japan's naval aviation had opened a corridor straight to Tokyo's industrial and political heart. As B-29 engines began warming on newly constructed runways, the psychological dimension of the aftermath grew even deeper. Japan's leaders knew that the war was shifting from distant seas to their own cities, factories, and families. Political fractures intensified within Tokyo, while hardline military factions insisted on continued resistance. Others within the government recognized that the loss of the Mobile fleet meant the empire could no longer defend its core territories. Minutes from Imperial General Headquarters meetings reveal growing disputes, some officials arguing that Japan must seek a negotiated end to avoid total ruin, others pushing for renewed offensives despite dwindling resources. The Navy, long the symbol of Japan's outward reach, now found itself unable to influence the war's direction. Its defeat forced the army to face alone the advancing American forces in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each battle fought with escalating casualties that reflected Japan's increasingly desperate strategic position. The death of naval aviation meant the empire had lost not only a military tool but a fundamental pillar of its national identity. Among the Japanese population, the psychological fallout was profound. Newspapers attempted to soften the severity of the defeat, but rumors and fragmented reports circulated widely, reaching families who had sons aboard the lost carriers. Mothers clutched photographs of pilots who would never return. Workers in shipyards and munitions factories felt the atmosphere shift. The confident speeches of the early war years were replaced by a quiet, anxious discipline. Civilians understood, even without official confirmation, that Japan's shield over the Pacific had been pierced beyond repair. Diaries from the period reveal a mixture of sorrow, exhaustion, and a dim awareness that the world was changing faster than the government could explain. One entry, written by a factory worker in Yokosuka, captured the mood. "The sea no longer protects us. It delivers our sorrow back to our shores." For historians, the magnitude of the Philippine Sea's aftermath stands among the most decisive moments of the entire conflict. The battle did not end the war outright, but it removed Japan's ability to shape its fate in the Pacific. It forced the empire onto a defensive path that culminated in the battles of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, each marked by escalating ferocity and dwindling strategic options. The United States, now commanding the skies and seas with unprecedented confidence, pressed forward with a momentum that could not be slowed. And for the sailors, pilots, and civilians who lived through that turning point, the memory of the burning horizon remained etched in their minds as the moment when Japan's war collapsed from a contest of might into a struggle for survival. In that realization lies the final truth of the aftermath, that the night Japan lost its nerve became the dawn that reshaped the Pacific and set the course for the war's final irrevocable trajectory.